The wine glass trembled in my hand, just barely, just enough for the burgundy to catch the overhead light and scatter it across the white tablecloth like tiny rubies. I had been mid-toast, something pleasant about family gatherings and autumn blessings, when I heard my daughter lean toward her husband. "Ignore her, she's just old." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying candle. Around the table, conversations continued, my son discussing quarterly reports, my daughter-in-law adjusting my granddaughter's napkin, the gentle hum of rain against the dining room windows. But everything had shifted, the way a photograph shifts when you realize the frame is crooked. I lowered the glass without completing the toast. The silence stretched long enough for everyone to notice, long enough for my daughter's cheeks to flush pink above her pearl necklace. She knew I had heard. As I was saying, I continued, raising the glass higher this time, my voice carrying across the room with the kind of clarity that comes from 68 years of learning when to whisper and when to project. Here's to the privilege of growing older. To the wisdom that comes with watching seasons change, to the strength that builds in quiet moments, and to the respect we show each other, regardless of age. I paused, meeting each pair of eyes around the table. The marigolds my granddaughter had picked from my garden that afternoon seemed to glow brighter in their mason jar centerpiece. Respect is not yours to give, it is mine to keep. I drank deeply, set the glass down with a gentle clink, and smiled. Not the apologetic smile I'd been wearing for months, but something steadier. Something that tasted like the first sip of perfectly brewed tea on a morning when you finally know what needs to be done. My daughter's fork clinked against her plate. My son cleared his throat. The rain continued its patient drumming against the glass, and somewhere in that rhythm, I heard the beginning of change. That night, I would lie awake until 3 a.m, watching shadows move across my bedroom ceiling. That night, I would make a list in my careful handwriting, the pen moving across paper with the kind of certainty that only comes after you've been polite for too long. That night, everything would begin to shift. But for now, I reached for the serving spoon and offered seconds on the sweet potato casserole, as if I hadn't just redrawn the boundaries of my own life with 17 words and a steady hand. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was necessary. 10 days can remake a quiet life. In 10 days, I would sign papers that restored my name to documents where it belonged. I would change locks with the solemnity of someone hanging new curtains, a simple act that transforms the entire room. I would plant marigold seeds in soil that had been waiting for attention, and I would write a letter that would never apologize for my existence. In 10 days, my kitchen would smell like fresh bread instead of old grievances. My phone would ring with invitations instead of instructions. My hands would remember the weight of wood and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful from something forgotten. The kettle would whistle at the same time each morning, 7:15, just as the first light touched the corner of my new garden. I would pour tea into the cup with the hairline crack, the one I'd rescued from the donation box, and I would sit by the window to watch the world wake up around me. Keys would jangle differently in my palm, fewer of them, but each one chosen. Envelopes would arrive addressed to the name I'd carried before marriage, the name that still felt like home when spoken aloud. A wooden picture frame would take shape under my hands, sanded smooth and stained the color of autumn leaves. In 10 days, I would understand the difference between being alone and being lonely. I would learn that the first is a choice and the second is a temporary condition that tea and good company can cure. But tonight, as I cleared the dinner dishes and felt the weight of unspoken apologies hanging in the air like humidity before a storm, I could only sense that something was shifting. The foundation of my carefully constructed compliance was developing hairline cracks, and through those cracks, something stronger was beginning to grow. My daughter helped with the dishes, silently, efficiently, the way she'd learned as a child. We moved around each other in the kitchen like dancers who'd forgotten the music but still remembered the steps. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "Mom, I didn't mean." "I know what you meant." I handed her the last plate to dry, our fingers touching briefly over the warm ceramic. "That's precisely why we need to talk about it. But not tonight." Tonight was for letting the words settle, for allowing the truth to take root in the space between what was said and what was heard. Tonight was for recognizing that change, like good bread, cannot be rushed. I walked her to the front door, where her coat hung on the same hook it had claimed since childhood. The rain had softened to a gentle whisper, and through the window, I could see my neighbor's porch light glowing like a lighthouse in the darkness. "Drive carefully," I said, because some habits of love are worth keeping. After she left, I sat in my living room with a cup of chamomile tea, listening to the house settle around me. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked each minute with its steady rhythm, and I realized I had been holding my breath for longer than I could remember. 10 days to learn the difference between bending and breaking. 10 days to discover that dignity, once reclaimed, wears as comfortably as an old sweater that still holds its shape. The smallest cuts are often the deepest. It had started months ago with tiny dismissals, the kind that slip past your defenses because they're wrapped in concern. "Let me handle that for you, Mom. Don't worry about those details. We'll take care of everything." I should have noticed when my name disappeared from the joint checking account papers, changed for convenience after my husband's death, when everything felt too complicated to question. I should have paid attention when my opinions became suggestions, then requests, then silence in the space where my voice used to live. The broken teacup should have been a sign. It was my grandmother's china, delicate blue flowers on cream porcelain, the kind of beautiful, fragile thing that deserves careful hands. My daughter-in-law had been washing dishes after Sunday lunch, moving with the efficiency of someone who values speed over sentiment. The crash was small, just a handle separating from its cup, a clean break that could have been mended. But instead of an apology, I heard an explanation. "These old dishes are so impractical, Mom. You should really consider getting something more durable." Old dishes. Old ways. Old woman. I had picked up the pieces and murmured something about super glue, about being more careful next time. But as I held those fragments in my palm, I felt something shift inside my chest, a recognition that I had been breaking piece by piece, so gradually that I hadn't noticed the damage. The paperwork had been next. Insurance forms appeared with different signatures required, medical decisions that somehow needed second opinions, and financial statements that arrived addressed to my son instead of me. Each change was logical, reasonable, temporary, until they weren't. "We're just trying to help," became the refrain that played like background music to my shrinking world. Help with driving, help with appointments, help with decisions I'd been making competently for decades. The clock in the kitchen began marking time differently, not in hours I planned, but in moments between other people's schedules. Lunch became dependent on when someone could drop by. Errands became favors to request rather than tasks to complete. My life became a series of accommodations made by people who loved me enough to assume I couldn't manage on my own. But love without trust is something else entirely. The night before the dinner party, I had found myself standing in my bathroom at 2 a.m, staring at my reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. When had my face become something that invited management instead of conversation? When had my age become my most defining characteristic? The woman looking back at me had been beautiful once, and was still beautiful now, just in a different way, like how autumn is beautiful after the easy glory of summer. But somewhere along the way, I had started apologizing for taking up space, for having opinions, for existing at an inconvenient age. I had pressed my palm against the cool glass and made a promise to the woman in the mirror, no more. The next morning, I had made coffee with the French press my husband brought back from Paris 20 years ago, the one my children thought was too much trouble. I had used the good china, even for breakfast, even for no one but myself. I had worn the silk scarf that made me feel elegant, and I had hummed while I cooked dinner for 8. By evening, I was ready to hear what they really thought of me. I was ready to stop pretending I didn't notice the gentle condescension, the benevolent dismissal, the assumption that my years had somehow diminished my worth rather than accumulated it. The broken teacup sat on my kitchen windowsill, still in 2 pieces, waiting for glue. But some things, I was beginning to understand, were meant to be transformed rather than simply repaired. The list began at 3:17 in the morning, when sleep finally admitted defeat and left me alone with the bedside lamp and a leather-bound notebook I'd received as a Christmas gift but never used. Things I no longer owe, I wrote at the top of the page, my handwriting steadier than it had been in months. The silver pen, another gift, this one from my husband on our 40th anniversary, felt substantial in my fingers, like a tool that had been waiting for the right job. Number 1 wrote itself, apology for existing. The words looked stark on the cream-colored paper, but they also looked true. When had I started every conversation with sorry? Sorry for calling, sorry for asking, sorry for needing, sorry for having opinions that differed from the accepted family wisdom about what was best for aging mothers. Number 2 came easier, explanation for every choice. Why did I want to keep driving when public transportation was available? Why did I insist on living alone when assisted living would be safer? Why did I prefer cooking my own meals when delivery was so convenient? As if my preferences had become problems to be solved rather than life to be lived. The pen moved across the paper with gathering momentum. Permission to use my own money. Justification for my friendships. Silence when decisions concern my life. Gratitude for being managed. Pretense that patronizing is kindness. I paused there, listening to the grandfather clock downstairs mark another quarter hour. The house was settled into that deep quiet that only comes in the small hours, when the world belongs to insomniacs and night shift workers and women making lists that should have been written years ago. Agreement with assessments of my limitations. Acceptance of others' timelines for my life. Compliance with comfort that isn't comfortable. The lamp created a warm circle of light in the darkness, and within that circle, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, the satisfaction of clarity. Each item on the list was a weight I had been carrying without realizing it, like someone who gradually adds heavier and heavier books to a bag until they can no longer remember how effortless walking used to feel. By 4:30, the list had grown to 15 items. By 5, I was making coffee and researching elder rights lawyers on my laptop, the one my son had suggested I might not need since I could just ask for help when I wanted to look something up online. The lawyer's website was clean and professional, with testimonials from clients who had needed to re-establish financial independence or clarify legal capacity. I bookmarked the page and made a note in my calendar, Tuesday 10 a.m., consultation. As dawn began to brighten the kitchen windows, I made myself breakfast with the kind of attention I usually reserved for when company was coming. Fresh orange juice squeezed by hand, eggs cooked exactly the way I preferred them, toast cut diagonally because it simply tasted better that way. I ate slowly, reading yesterday's newspaper that I'd been too flustered to finish, letting my mind wander through the day ahead. I would run errands at my own pace. I would stop by the library to renew my volunteer reading schedule, the one my daughter thought was too tiring for someone my age. I would have lunch at the small cafe near the bank, where the owner always asked about my garden and never suggested that someone else should order for me. But first, I would visit the bank. The decision crystallized as I finished my coffee, solid and unshakable as the oak tree in my backyard that had weathered 40 years of storms by bending without breaking. I would restore my sole signature authority on the accounts that bore my name. I would review every document, ask every question, and make every decision for myself. Freedom begins with a tidy list and steady pen, I wrote at the bottom of the page, and the sentence felt like a promise I was finally ready to keep. The bank smelled like industrial carpet and ambition, with undertones of the vanilla air freshener that couldn't quite mask the anxiety that seemed to cling to every surface. I had dressed carefully for this appointment, the navy suit that made me feel competent, the pearls that reminded me I had good taste, the shoes that added just enough height to help me look the young accounts manager directly in the eye. Fictional narrative. Not legal or financial advice. I'd like to review all the accounts where my name appears, I said, settling into the chair across from her desk with the kind of calm that comes from having rehearsed this conversation 3 times in my car before walking through the front doors. Jennifer, her nameplate announced her as Jennifer Morrison, assistant manager, couldn't have been older than 35. She had the kind of bright efficiency that comes from training seminars and performance reviews, and she handled my request with the smooth professionalism of someone who'd had this conversation before. Of course, Mrs. Patterson. Let me pull up your records. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, and I watched her expression shift from routine helpfulness to mild confusion. I see that there was a change made to your checking account about 6 months ago. Yes. I'd like to change it back. She scrolled through screens I couldn't see, her brow furrowing slightly. The change added your son as a cosigner for convenience purposes. To reverse that, You'll need my signature and my identification, both of which I have with me. I placed my driver's license and the folder of documents I'd prepared on her desk. My husband passed away 8 months ago. The cosigner addition was made during a time when I was overwhelmed with arrangements. I'm no longer overwhelmed. Jennifer glanced at the papers, then back at her screen. I understand. It's just that these changes were made fairly recently, and typically when we see requests to modify account access, we recommend that all parties involved be present too. I am the account holder. My voice remained steady, but I could feel something steel-like straightening in my spine. My son was added as a convenience. I no longer require that convenience. She nodded quickly, perhaps recognizing something in my tone that suggested this conversation could go in one of two directions, and only one of them would end with satisfied customer service scores. The paperwork took 20 minutes. 20 minutes to reclaim access to money I had earned, saved, and managed successfully for decades. 20 minutes to restore my name to its proper place on documents that governed my daily life. 20 minutes to remember what it felt like to be treated as competent until proven otherwise, rather than the reverse. You'll receive new checks and a new debit card within 7 to 10 business days, Jennifer said, sliding the final document across the desk for my signature. Is there anything else I can help you with today? I signed my name with deliberate care, the pen making the kind of confident strokes that indicated someone who planned to be using this signature for years to come. Actually, yes. I'd like information about setting up a trust. The rain that had been threatening all morning finally arrived as I walked back to my car, fat droplets that drummed against my umbrella with satisfying authority. I paused before getting into the driver's seat, feeling the weight of the new account documentation in my purse and the lighter weight of something else, the absence of the constant low-level anxiety that had been humming in the background of my life for months. Paper is power when you understand it, I said aloud to no one in particular, then smiled at the sound of my own voice speaking truth to the autumn air. The drive home took me past the locksmith's shop, where I impulsively pulled into the parking lot. Some momentum, once started, demands to be followed to its natural conclusion. The knock came at 7:30 the next evening, during the quiet hour when I usually made tea and watched the news. I knew it was my son before I opened the door. The particular rhythm of his knock, confident but not quite demanding, the same pattern he'd used since he was tall enough to reach the brass knocker. Hi, Mom. David stood on my front porch wearing his serious expression, the one he'd inherited from his father, along with the ability to make spreadsheets out of emotions. We need to talk. I had been expecting this conversation since the moment I'd signed the bank papers. I had practiced staying calm, practiced responding instead of reacting, practiced the difference between defending myself and simply stating facts. Come in, I said, stepping aside to let him enter. I was just making tea. He followed me to the kitchen, his footsteps heavier than usual on the hardwood floors. I could feel his tension in the way he stood too close to the counter, the way his hands fidgeted with his car keys. The bank called Michael. Michael was his friend from college, the one who worked in financial planning and had somehow become the family authority on what was appropriate for aging parents. They said you'd made some changes to your accounts. I poured water into the kettle and placed it on the stove, taking my time with the familiar ritual. I restored sole signature authority. The accounts are in my name. Mom. His voice carried the exasperated patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone who should understand better. We added me to those accounts for your protection. what if something happens? What if you can't get to the bank, or forget to pay bills, or what if I remain a competent adult who manages her own finances? I interrupted gently, turning to face him. The kettle hadn't started whistling yet, but I could hear the water beginning to warm, tiny bubbles forming at the bottom of the pot. That's not what I meant. He ran his hand through his hair, another gesture inherited from his father, though David's hair was already showing silver at the temples. We're trying to help you. We're trying to make sure you're taken care of. I understand that's your intention. I reached for 2 cups from the cabinet, the simple white ones that could withstand being handled with less than perfect care. But I need you to understand that being taken care of and being managed are not the same thing. His jaw tightened. So what, you're just going to cut us all out? Make decisions without talking to anyone? What happens when you can't handle things on your own anymore? The kettle began its low whistle, and I turned off the heat before it could reach full volume. Some conversations required quiet. David, I've been handling things on my own for 8 months. Before that, I handled them with your father for 42 years. I paid bills, managed investments, made medical decisions, and navigated every challenge that came our way. Your father's death didn't erase my capacity for judgment, it just left me temporarily overwhelmed by grief. I poured the hot water over the tea bags, watching the amber color bloom through the clear liquid. Earl Grey for both of us, his preference since college, another small way of showing love through attention to detail. I'm not cutting you out. I'm inviting you back in as my son instead of my supervisor. There's a difference. He accepted the cup I offered him, but I could see in his expression that he was still processing what I'd said, still trying to reconcile his image of protecting me with my description of being controlled. Mom, you're 68 years old. Yes. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd fed him breakfast before school for 12 years, where I'd helped him with homework and listened to him practice debate team arguments. I'm 68 years old, which means I have nearly 7 decades of experience making decisions. Some good, some poor, all mine to make. We sat in silence for several minutes, sipping tea that was still too hot and listening to the distant sound of the neighbor's dog barking at something only he could perceive. The kitchen felt smaller with his tension in it, but also more honest than it had been in months. I love you, he said finally, his voice softer than it had been when he arrived. I don't want anything to happen to you. I love you too. I reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. But nothing is happening to me, David. Something is happening for me. I'm remembering how to live instead of simply being managed. The kettle clicked as it cooled, a small sound that somehow felt like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. Outside, the rain had returned, gentle and persistent against the kitchen windows. Love does not require surrender, I said, as much to myself as to him. He finished his tea and left shortly after, with the kind of hug that suggested more questions than answers, but also the possibility that questions were enough for now. After he left, I stood at the sink washing our cups, thinking about the difference between protecting someone and trusting them to protect themselves. The rain continued through the night, and I fell asleep to its steady rhythm, feeling something like peace settling over me for the first time in months. The tea arrived before I did. I was sitting on my front porch the next afternoon, reading a book about garden design and occasionally looking up to watch the leaves change color in the oak tree, when Margaret appeared at the end of my walkway carrying a thermal carafe and wearing a smile that suggested she understood something about the difference between solitude and loneliness. I brought chamomile, she called, climbing the porch steps with the careful grace of someone who had learned not to trust every surface to hold her weight securely. And the kind of cookies that taste better when someone else bakes them. Margaret lived 3 houses down and had buried her husband 2 years before I buried mine. She had hair that had gone silver without apology and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who had spent decades creating beauty in small spaces. We had been neighbors for 15 years, but had become friends only recently, the kind of friendship that builds between women who suddenly find themselves redefining their lives in the spaces their husbands used to occupy. Perfect timing, I said, marking my place in the book and gesturing toward the wicker chair beside mine. I was just thinking about how much better conversation tastes than contemplation. She settled into the chair with a small sigh of satisfaction and began unpacking supplies from her canvas bag. Contemplation has its place, but it's better served with someone who can disagree with your conclusions. The tea was perfect, not too hot, flavored with honey that must have come from local hives, served in actual china cups instead of the disposable mugs that seemed to have taken over the world. Margaret had the gift of making ordinary moments feel ceremonial without pretension. "You look different," she said after we had each taken our first sip and settled into the comfortable rhythm of afternoon conversation. "Rested, maybe. Or resolved." I considered this. "Both, I think. I changed the locks yesterday." She nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Good locks or symbolic locks?" "Both of those, too." I smiled and told her about the bank, about the conversation with David, about the list I'd made in the early morning hours when sleep seemed less important than clarity. Margaret listened the way good friends listen, with attention that felt like a gift, with questions that helped me understand my own thoughts better, with observations that made me feel heard rather than diagnosed. "The hardest part," she said when I finished, "is teaching people who love you that love doesn't require management. They think they're protecting you from mistakes, but what they're really protecting you from is living." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the neighborhood slowly transition from the busy energy of mid-afternoon to the softer pace of early evening. A few houses down, children were playing in a front yard, their laughter carrying on the breeze like music that improved everything it touched. "I keep thinking about my daughter," I said eventually. About the way she looked when I confronted what she'd said. Like she genuinely hadn't realized it was cruel. Margaret refilled both our cups from the thermal carafe. Sometimes the people who love us most are the least able to see us clearly. They love the version of us they're comfortable with, and when we change, it feels like betrayal instead of growth. A cardinal landed on the porch railing, bright red against the white painted wood, and stayed long enough for us both to admire its confidence before flying away toward whatever business cardinals conduct in the late afternoon. "What did you do?" I asked. "When did your children start treating you like a problem to be solved instead of a person to be respected?" "I moved." She laughed at my expression. "Not far, just to the little apartment complex near the park. Close enough for Sunday dinner, far enough for Tuesday independence." It took about 6 months for them to remember that I was their mother, not their dependent. The idea had occurred to me, but hearing it spoken aloud by someone who had actually done it made it feel less like fantasy and more like a possibility. "We survived by pouring each other another cup," Margaret said, suiting action to words. "And by remembering that respect is something we teach as much as something we earn." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that matched the marigolds still blooming in my garden, I felt something I had almost forgotten, the pleasure of being understood by someone who chose to see my strength rather than catalog my vulnerabilities. When Margaret finally gathered her things to leave, she paused at the bottom of the porch steps. "The locksmith did good work," she said, examining my front door with an expert eye. "But the real security comes from knowing you choose who has access to your peace." That night, I made dinner for one without apologizing to anyone for the modest portion size or the simple preparation. I ate by candlelight because it felt ceremonial, and I went to bed at 9 o'clock because it felt right, and I woke up the next morning excited about the day ahead instead of anxious about navigating it. The locksmith's morning arrived gray and misty, the kind of weather that makes everything look soft around the edges and suggests that transformation might be easier than expected. I had been awake since 5:30, not from insomnia but from anticipation, the way you wake up early on the first day of vacation, or the morning you finally decide to have that difficult conversation you've been avoiding. I made coffee with careful attention to detail, grinding the beans fresh, measuring the water precisely, timing the brewing process while I watched the sky lighten gradually through the kitchen windows. By the time the locksmith's van pulled into my driveway, I was ready. "Morning, Mrs. Patterson." The locksmith was a woman about my daughter's age, with capable hands and the kind of straightforward manner that suggested she understood the difference between changing locks for security and changing locks for independence. "I'm Sarah. We spoke yesterday about the full-service package." I led her to the front door, where she examined the existing hardware with professional thoroughness. "These are good quality locks, but they're about 15 years old. The new system will be more secure, and you'll have options for keypad entry if you prefer not to carry keys." While she worked, I found myself thinking about the symbolic weight of what was happening. Each old lock that came away from the door frame was a small declaration of independence, each new cylinder a promise that I would choose who had access to my space, my peace, my daily life. "The back door, too?" Sarah asked, and I nodded. By mid-morning, she had finished the installation and was showing me how the new system worked. The keys felt different in my hand, heavier, more substantial, with edges that hadn't yet been worn smooth by daily use. "I always recommend that people start fresh with the key distribution," Sarah said as she packed up her tools. "Decide who needs access now, not who had access before." After she left, I sat at my kitchen table with 5 shiny new keys spread in front of me like possibilities. One for my purse, one for the spare key lockbox I would install myself, and one for Margaret in case of emergencies. The other 2 could wait until I decided who deserved them. The afternoon was for errands that felt different now that I was carrying keys that belonged completely to me. At the Department of Motor Vehicles, I updated my address on file, not because I was moving yet, but because I wanted to practice the feel of paperwork that reflected my current reality rather than historical convenience. At the courthouse, I picked up forms for name restoration, simple papers that would allow me to reclaim my maiden name for legal documents if I chose to. Not a rejection of my marriage, but an acknowledgement that I had existed before it and might choose to exist differently after it. The copy shop was next, where I had business cards printed with my name and phone number, no title except Margaret Eleanor Patterson in clean, simple font. I ordered 50 cards, which seemed optimistic for someone who was just beginning to remember what she wanted to be called. At the post office, I opened a new mailbox, smaller than the home delivery I'd relied on for decades, but private in a way that felt important. I would check it myself, sort my own mail, decide what required action and what could wait. "Some doors close kindly, if you pay them respect," I said to myself as I tested the mailbox key for the first time, and the phrase felt like a prayer of gratitude for the simple complexity of starting over. The drive home took me past the community center, where a sign advertised woodworking classes for beginners. I pulled into the parking lot without planning to, drawn by a sudden memory of the satisfaction I used to find in creating something beautiful with my hands. The instructor was a retired carpenter with paint-stained fingers and the kind of patience that suggested he enjoyed teaching more than he had enjoyed deadlines. He showed me around the workshop, explained the basic tools, and described projects that ranged from simple cutting boards to elaborate furniture. "We meet twice a week," he said. "Tuesday mornings and Thursday evenings. Next session starts Monday." I signed up for Tuesday mornings, paid the fee with my new checkbook, and scheduled my first project, a picture frame size to hold the photograph I had been meaning to display, the one of me and my husband on our honeymoon, both of us young and laughing and certain that we understood what forever meant. That evening, I cooked dinner with ingredients I had chosen purely for pleasure rather than nutrition or convenience. Fresh pasta with basil from the garden, wine that had been waiting for a reason to be opened, bread that I had baked myself that afternoon while the locksmith worked. I ate slowly, reading a novel I had borrowed from the library, one that had nothing to do with self-improvement or practical advice and everything to do with the pleasure of language used beautifully. When I finished, I washed the dishes by hand instead of using the dishwasher, just for the satisfaction of warm water and soap bubbles and the meditative rhythm of simple work. Before bed, I walked through my house with the new keys in my hand, checking locks that now belonged entirely to me, turning off lights in rooms that would remain exactly as I left them until I chose to change them. The workbench was exactly the right height. I discovered this on Tuesday morning, when I arrived at the community center workshop carrying my grandmother's carpenter's apron, The one I had found in the back of my closet while looking for something else entirely, the one that still smelled faintly of sawdust and determination. "Perfect fit," said Tom, the instructor, as I adjusted the apron strings around my waist. "Your grandmother was a carpenter?" "During the war. Built kitchen cabinets for the housing development where my grandfather worked." I ran my hand along the smooth surface of the workbench, feeling the slight depressions left by thousands of projects, the accumulated wisdom of wood shaped by patient hands. "I used to watch her work when I was small. She said wood has its own opinion about what it wants to become." The other students were a mix of ages and intentions, a young father building a toy chest for his daughter, a woman about my age creating garden planters, a teenager working on a chess set for his grandfather. We were united by the desire to make something useful with our hands, to transform raw materials into objects that would outlast our efforts. I started with pine, Tom's recommendation for beginners. "Forgiving wood," he called it. "Takes instruction well, doesn't hold grudges if you make mistakes." The picture frame began as 4 pieces of lumber, cut to measure on the table saw with Tom's guidance. I learned to check each angle twice, to mark cuts with a pencil instead of assuming I would remember, and to measure from multiple points to ensure accuracy. "Take your time," Tom said when I started to rush the first miter cut. "Wood doesn't care about your schedule." Slowly, methodically, I cut the joints that would hold the frame together. The saw made a satisfying sound as it moved through the pine, and the sawdust that accumulated around my feet smelled like possibility. By the end of the morning, I had 4 pieces that fit together perfectly, corners that would need glue and clamps to become permanent, but already looked like something that could hold and protect whatever was placed inside it. "Next week, we'll sand and stain," Tom said as I cleaned my tools and returned them to their designated places. "Then you'll have something beautiful." I drove home with my hands smelling like wood and my mind quiet in a way it hadn't been for months. The simple satisfaction of creating something, of following a plan that led to visible progress, of using skills I had forgotten I possessed, all of it felt like reclaiming a part of myself that had been lost in the daily maintenance of other people's concerns. That afternoon, I cleared space in my basement for a small workshop of my own. Nothing elaborate, just a workbench I ordered online, basic hand tools, and a corner where I could continue projects between classes. The basement had been a storage space for years, accumulating the overflow of a life lived in the same house for decades. Now it would become something more intentional. As I sorted through boxes, deciding what to keep and what to donate, I found a folder of letters I had written but never sent. Letters to my children during difficult periods, letters to my husband during the early years of marriage when I was still learning how to be angry and loving at the same time, letters to myself that documented dreams I had set aside for practical considerations. Among them was a draft of a letter to my daughter, written 6 months after her father's death. In it, I had tried to explain the difference between grief and incapacity, between needing support and needing control, between helping someone heal and managing their entire existence. I had never sent it because it seemed too raw, too likely to cause pain in a relationship that was already strained by loss and changing dynamics. But reading it now, I realized it wasn't raw, it was honest. And honesty, delivered with love, was a gift even when it felt uncomfortable to receive. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with good paper and my silver pen, and I wrote a new letter to my daughter. Not an angry letter or a defensive letter, but a clear letter that explained what I needed from our relationship and what I was prepared to offer in return. "Repair is slower than revenge, and worth it," I wrote near the end, and the sentence felt like a promise I was finally ready to keep. I sealed the letter in an envelope, but didn't address it yet. Some conversations require the right timing, and I was learning to trust my instincts about when that timing had arrived. The house with marigolds was smaller than I had imagined it would be. I found it on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the air had turned crisp enough to require a sweater but not so cold as to discourage walking through neighborhoods I had always driven past without stopping. The real estate agent was a woman named Linda who specialized in right-sizing, helping older adults find homes that fit their current lives rather than accommodating the ghosts of their previous ones. "The garden is the real treasure," Linda said as we walked up the brick pathway lined with marigolds that seemed to glow like small suns in the autumn light. The previous owner was a master gardener. Everything is established, low maintenance, designed to bloom from spring through fall. The house itself was practical without being plain: 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a kitchen with windows that faced east toward the morning light. The living room had built-in bookshelves and a fireplace that looked like it had been used for warmth rather than decoration. Every room was bright, every space felt intentional. But it was the garden that decided for me. Behind the house, a small patio opened onto raised beds filled with herbs and perennials, fruit trees espaliered against the back fence, and a corner dedicated entirely to flowers, not just marigolds, but asters and chrysanthemums, late-blooming roses, and ornamental grasses that caught the breeze like music. The shed comes with the property, Linda said, opening the door to reveal shelves lined with clay pots, gardening tools arranged with the care of someone who understood that beautiful storage makes work more pleasant, and a small workbench positioned to catch the light from the single window. I could imagine myself here. I could see my coffee cup on the kitchen windowsill while I watched birds visit the feeder hanging from the apple tree. I could picture my books on the built-in shelves, my grandmother's china in the dining room cabinet, my new picture frame on the mantel holding the photograph of a younger self who was just beginning to understand what forever meant. "I'll take it," I said, and Linda smiled as if she had been expecting this moment since we first shook hands. The paperwork took 3 weeks. During that time, I sorted through 4 decades of accumulated possessions, keeping what brought joy or served a purpose and donating the rest to organizations that could transform my excess into someone else's necessity. I hired estate sale professionals to handle the furniture that wouldn't fit in the new space, and I was surprised by how little I missed once it was gone. The dining room table that had hosted so many family gatherings, the living room furniture that had been chosen for durability rather than comfort, the extra sets of dishes that had been practical when entertaining was frequent, all of it found new homes where it would be appreciated rather than simply maintained. What remained were the pieces that told my story: the rocking chair where I had nursed my children, the desk where I had paid bills and written letters, the garden tools that had helped me coax beauty from earth and seed and patience. On moving day, I packed my car with the most essential items: clothes for a week, the basic supplies for making tea and toast, and the letter I had written to my daughter. The movers would handle everything else, but these few things needed to travel with me as witnesses to the transition. At the lawyer's office, I signed the final papers that established a trust fund for women's literacy, not a large endowment, but enough to sponsor library programs for women who had never learned to read or who wanted to improve their skills. It felt like the right use for money that had been sitting in accounts earning interest but not a purpose. "This will help women who are starting over," the lawyer explained as I signed the documents. "Women who need independence but lack some of the basic tools for achieving it." The irony was not lost on me, using my own newfound independence to help other women find theirs, creating a circle of empowerment that would extend beyond my own immediate needs. That afternoon, I planted my first seeds in the new garden, tulip bulbs that would bloom in spring, marking the full completion of 1 year in this life I was choosing rather than simply accepting. They went into the ground with the solemnity of promises made to a future self who would be here to see them bloom. "Roots can choose new earth," I said to the soil and the sky and anyone who might be listening, and the words felt like both prayer and prophecy. The bread rose while I waited for courage. It was Tuesday morning in my new kitchen, exactly 3 weeks after the move, and I had been awake since 5 o'clock, timing the rhythm of yeast and flour and the letter that still sat unsealed on my kitchen counter. Outside the window, the apple tree was hosting its daily convention of cardinals and finches, their bright chatter providing a soundtrack to my own internal debate about whether some conversations were better held in person or committed to paper first. The letter had been rewritten 4 times. The first version was too angry, the second too apologetic, the third too long. This final version said what needed to be said in language that came from love rather than hurt, with boundaries that felt firm rather than punitive. The phone rang just as I was checking the bread's progress. My daughter's number appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail while I decided whether I was ready for this conversation to happen spontaneously rather than according to my carefully planned timeline. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, answering on the fourth ring. "Mom." Sarah's voice carried a mixture of relief and hesitation, the sound of someone who had been building up to this call for several days. "I got your new address from David. I was wondering, could I come see the house?" Through the kitchen window, I watched a cardinal land on the bird feeder and begin the patient work of selecting exactly the right seeds. The morning light caught the red of his feathers and turned it into something that looked like joy made visible. "I'd like that," I said, and meant it. "Are you free this afternoon?" She arrived at 2 o'clock carrying a small potted plant, a peace lily, which I recognized as both a thoughtful gift and a symbolic gesture. We hugged on the front porch, carefully, the way people embrace when they're not sure what boundaries have shifted but want to acknowledge that something has changed. "It's beautiful," she said as I gave her the tour, and I could hear genuine pleasure in her voice as she examined the built-in bookshelves, admired the garden views from every window, and tested the rocking chair that I had positioned to catch the afternoon light. We ended up in the kitchen, where the bread had finished its rise and was ready for the oven. I slipped the loaf pan into the preheated oven and set the timer, then put the kettle on for tea. "Mom, about that dinner," Sarah began, but I held up a hand to pause her. "Before we talk about that, I want you to read something." I handed her the letter, still in its unsealed envelope. "Take your time." She read standing by the kitchen window, and I watched her expression move through surprise, recognition, and something that might have been relief. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and looked up at me with eyes that were bright but not tearful. "I didn't realize," she said quietly. "I know. That's what made it so painful, not that you intended to hurt me, but that my feelings had become so invisible that you could dismiss me without even noticing you were doing it." We sat at the small kitchen table, and I poured tea into cups that were wedding gifts from 43 years ago, china that had survived multiple moves and thousands of washings and was still beautiful enough to make ordinary conversation feel ceremonial. "I was scared," Sarah admitted. "After Dad died, you seemed so fragile. Every decision felt like it could be the wrong one, and we thought if we could just take care of the practical things, you could focus on healing." "But healing isn't the same as being healed for," I said gently. "And protecting someone from all decisions is the same as protecting them from their own life." We talked for an hour, working through misunderstandings that had been growing like weeds in the space between intention and impact. Sarah apologized for the specific comment that had started this whole transformation, and I apologized for letting resentment build instead of addressing problems as they arose. "I want to be part of your life," she said as the timer chimed and I pulled the bread from the oven. "But I want to be your daughter, not your manager." "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." The bread was perfect, golden brown with a crust that sounded hollow when tapped, the kind of simple success that feels like a small miracle when you've been patient enough to let it develop properly. I sliced it while it was still warm, spread it with butter, and the blackberry jam my neighbor Margaret had brought as a housewarming gift. "This is the best bread I've ever had," Sarah said, and I knew she meant more than just the texture and flavor. As she prepared to leave, she paused in the doorway and looked back at the house that was already beginning to feel like home. "You seem different here. More like yourself." "I am more like myself," I agreed. It just took me a while to remember who that was. After she left, I sat on my front porch with a second cup of tea, watching the marigolds catch the late afternoon light and thinking about the difference between love that controls and love that trusts. The peace lily she had brought sat beside me in its terracotta pot, already beginning to show new growth. "Love without control still tastes sweet," I said to the garden and the gathering dusk, and the words felt like a recipe I was finally ready to follow. 6 months later, I stood in the community center holding a wine glass that didn't tremble, looking out at a room full of women who had gathered to hear stories about quiet rebellions, small acts of courage that had changed ordinary lives in extraordinary ways. I had been invited to speak about aging with dignity, about the difference between being cared for and being managed, about the ways women can reclaim their voices when the world starts treating them like background music instead of the featured performance. The woman who introduced me was about my daughter's age, part of a group that organized monthly lectures on topics relevant to women navigating life transitions. She had read about my literacy trust fund in the local newspaper and had asked if I would be willing to share my story. "Our speaker tonight," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, reminds us that it's never too late to rewrite the rules of our own lives. I approached the podium wearing the navy suit that had accompanied me to the bank that first day, carrying index cards covered with notes I had practiced but hoped I wouldn't need. The audience was diverse, women in their 20s through their 80s, some accompanied by friends, others sitting alone with the particular attention of people who had come to hear something they needed to understand. "Good evening," I began, and was pleased to hear that my voice sounded steady, clear, and confident. 6 months ago, I would have apologized for taking your time before I began talking. Tonight, I'm going to skip the apology and get straight to the point. A few people laughed, and I felt the familiar settling that happens when you realize your audience is with you rather than simply tolerating you. I want to tell you about a dinner party where my daughter whispered that everyone should ignore me because I was just old. I want to tell you about what happened when I decided to speak louder instead of smaller. The story unfolded more easily than I had expected. I talked about the wine glass moment, about the list I had made in the early morning darkness, about changing locks and reclaiming bank accounts and learning to use power tools. I talked about the difference between being protected and being trusted, about the ways we teach people how to treat us by what we're willing to accept. I talked about Margaret and her gift for making ordinary moments feel ceremonial, about the locksmith who understood that some jobs are practical and symbolic at the same time, about the bread that rose while I waited for courage. "The marigolds in my garden are blooming again," I said near the end. "Same roots, same soil, but this year they're growing in the earth I chose rather than the earth I inherited. That's the difference between accepting your life and creating it." I paused, looking out at faces that were paying attention with the kind of focus that suggested recognition, women seeing parts of their own stories reflected in mine. "I'd like to close with a toast," I said, raising my wine glass just as I had that night 6 months ago, but this time to an audience that had chosen to listen rather than one that had learned to dismiss. "Here's to the privilege of growing older, and to the wisdom that comes from watching seasons change. Here's to the strength that builds in quiet moments, and to the respect we show each other, and ourselves, regardless of age. Here's to speaking louder when the world suggests we should speak smaller, and to the courage it takes to choose dignity over compliance." I paused, meeting eyes throughout the room, seeing nods of recognition and agreement. This time, they leaned in to listen. The applause was warm and sustained, and several women approached me afterward to share their own stories of quiet rebellion, their own moments of choosing dignity over convenience, their own discoveries that it's never too late to rewrite the rules of your own life. One woman, about my age but with the particular weariness that comes from being managed instead of respected, pressed a piece of paper into my hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I needed to hear this tonight." The paper contained her phone number and a note, "I'd like to change my locks too. Would you have coffee with me next week?" I drove home through streets lit by autumn moonlight, past houses where other people were living their lives according to rules they may or may not have chosen for themselves. My own house appeared around the corner, front porch light glowing like a beacon, marigolds still blooming in the border garden despite the October chill. Inside, I made tea with the proper ceremony, good china, careful timing, attention to detail that transforms routine into ritual. I sat by the living room window with my cup and the book I was reading, a novel about women who had lived brave lives in difficult times. On the mantel, the picture frame I had built in woodworking class held the photograph of my younger self, laughing with the husband who had taught me about love without control. Beside it sat a smaller frame holding a picture from tonight's event, me at the podium, wine glass raised, speaking to an audience that had chosen to listen. The house settled around me with the particular quiet that comes at the end of a day when you have used your voice for something that mattered. Tomorrow, I would wake up in this life I had chosen rather than inherited. I would make breakfast with ingredients I had selected for pleasure rather than convenience. I would tend a garden planted in soil I had chosen, water flowers that bloomed according to their own timeline rather than someone else's schedule. Tomorrow, I will be 69 years old, and that would be a privilege rather than an apology. Outside my window, the marigolds swayed in the evening breeze, their golden faces turned toward the moonlight, still beautiful, still blooming, still reaching toward whatever light they could find.